All right, so let's talk about who the Palestinians are. Palestinian comes originally from a translation of the Philistines. The Philistines, as a people, you can read about them all over the Bible in the Old Testament. The Philistines originally came from the Greek island of Crete by way of the sea. Philistine is a Hebrew name, and in the Hebrew it's Fleshtin, which literally means invader. And so the Philistines were the original invaders, if you will, of the land. And originally those invaders, the Philistines, sought to, in essence, colonize that part of the Middle East. So Palestine, the land of the Philistines, is literally an invaded land. And so when people talk these days about Israel invading Palestine, let's just be clear that that land was invaded, if you want to talk about Palestinians, by the original Palestinians, which would be the Philistines. In the 7th century BC, the Philistines were assimilated by the Assyrian. So the Assyrians came down into that part of the world and assimilated the Philistines, and then the Babylonians came and beat up the Assyrians. And from that point on, the Philistines, as a people group, disappeared from history. No one would claim to be a Philistine, and nobody would have that DNA nor heritage. And honestly, if anybody wants to claim that heritage, they would need to claim their homeland as Crete, not the area of Israel. It's interesting. The chief of the Palestinian military operations for the PLO, so the chief military operations for the Palestinian Liberation Operation, now known as the Palestinian Authority, but the chief military operator, Zahir Muhsin, says this: "We are all part of one people. Just for political reasons, we carefully underwrite our Palestinian identity." So he says, we play the Palestinian identity card for political reasons. That's what he says. He goes on, because it is of our national interest of the Arabs to advocate the existence of Palestinians to balance Zionism. He says, so it benefits us Arab people to advocate Palestinianism to balance Zionism so the Jews don't take too much. He says the existence of a separate Palestinian identity exists only for tactical reasons. So the only reason we claim a separate Palestinian identity other than our born Arab identity in these other nations is for tactical reasons. He goes on, he says the establishment of a Palestinian state is a new tool to continue the fight against Israel for Arab unity. He said, so we developed a new tool because the conventional warfare wasn't working. Here's what he means. In all these surrounding nations of Israel, they would wage war against Israel. Little tiny Israel just keep defeating them all. And so a new tool had to be developed to try to overthrow the Jews in Israel. And that new tool was political warfare combined with terrorism and diplomacy to achieve this, what open warfare couldn't achieve. And so they put together this idea: we're going to rally around this world Palestinian, we are Palestinians, and use that combined with terrorism and diplomacy, so you get other countries fighting for Palestinians against Israel, to achieve what warfare couldn't. We're going to beat them that way. In 1964, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Operation, wrote their charter of who they would be, and they defined Palestine borders to be those as the same as the British defined them way back in the day after World War I. However, in Article 24 of their own charter, the PLO explicitly asserts that Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, the West Bank that they're fighting over, were not Palestinian. It's very clear. The interesting thing is 4 years later, in 1968, the PLO rewrote their charter, and it suddenly included Judea, Samaria, and Gaza as part of their Palestinian state. What changed? What changed from the first charter in 1964 and the second charter in 1968? Well, what changed was 1967. And in 1967, all these Arab states got together to wage war against Israel, and Israel beat them. It's called the 6-Day War. 6 days, Israel whooped them. And these Israeli forces definitively captured and maintained Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. So then, after the Six-Day War in 1967, in 1968, the PLO rewrote their charter and included those areas so that they could try to claim them as their own and begin this proliferation to say that Israel took their land. So interesting. So this Palestinian group is really a political group that was originally formed for a political agenda to kick Israel out. There are no real Palestinians from the nation of Palestine. It doesn't exist. So why the interest in that area? Well, in the late 1800s, there were maybe 300,000 people living in that area. In the late 1800s, that land had been abused, it had been uncared for. As far as agriculture is concerned, the top layer was just decimated. The top layer of soil was decimated, not replenished. The land had become barren. These landowners basically sold this pieces of what they deemed unusable land to willing Jews who were willing to pay exorbitant prices. There were a few Muslims living in the area, but many of them were violently opposed to each other. They were not united, and none of them would claim that they were Palestinian. But there were large numbers of Jews that were living in the areas of Galilee, of Jerusalem, of Hebron, of Tiberias, of Safed, and mainly the population of Jerusalem was Jews. Less than a quarter of the population of Jerusalem was Muslims. And that was in the late 1800s. By about 1878, the Ottoman Sultan launched a resettlement strategy and policy to bring a bunch of Muslims back into the land of Israel. And then after 1880, a great wave of Muslim immigrants entered the land because it was essentially wide open territory. I mean, 300,000 people living in that area. It's ridiculous. There's millions of them living now. I mean, it was just wide open. But the vast majority of them never called themselves Palestinian. And they were these other Muslims moving in from other countries, other nations moving in. There's no way they had 1,000-year heritage and roots in that area. They just didn't. The interesting thing is you look at the United Nations in 1948. The United Nations defined what a Palestinian refugee was, and what they defined it was any non-Jew who had left that region during the war in 1948, whose family had been residing there for 2 years. That's it. So if you'd lived in that area for 2 years and left during the war of 1948, you were deemed a Palestinian refugee. It has nothing to do with truly your ancestors actually being there whatsoever. And with such a definition of a Palestinian refugee, the numbers exploded. Everybody could claim that they were Palestinian refugees and blame it on Israel. If you took that definition off the table, those who would actually qualify as Palestinian refugees would be reduced by a fraction of what it is. So here's what happened. The Jews acquired that land, but they didn't do it by force. I could go into a lot of stuff here. In 1937, there was a thing called the Peel Commission, which was a British government sent some of their people to investigate the brutality that was going on in the area. And during the investigation, one of the guys in the Peel Commission interviewed a man named Haj Amin al-Husani and testified about how did the Jews get the land. And Husani confirmed that the Jews, his words, purchased the land from the landowners because the land was unusable. And he says, in fact, the Jews did not take it by force. This was interesting because this guy Husani, his family was large landowners, and they got their land by going to all these little small landowners and threatening them with death if they didn't sign their land over to Husani's family. And so Husani's family would gather these huge conglomerates of land on pennies on the dollar, and then they would sell them what appeared to be worthless pieces of land to Jews at exorbitant prices. He himself testified to that very thing. They did not steal the land. They didn't take it by force. It was sold to them. And as a result, the Peel Commission, in their investigation, divided the land between in two different sections. There's the Jewish Palestine and the Arab Palestine. But all Jews included, all of them were considered Palestinian. But what's happening now is history's being rewritten, And now non-Jews are claiming sole ownership of Palestine as Palestinians and saying that Israel's trying to take again their Palestinian lands that's rightfully theirs. So here's the thing, if Palestinian Arabs wanted to return to their true countries of origin and homeland, they would have to return to Egypt and Iraq and Morocco and Syria, but not to Israel. It's false to say that there's 1,000-year-old Palestinian people that are just trying to keep their ancestral land that Israel took by force by these Zionist Jews. There was no Palestinian people in Palestinian land to begin with. So I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to come back to what's going on in our day and age right now.